Part 1, Introduction, The Power of English and a Dream. There are moments in life when a single skill can unlock doors you never imagined. For me, that skill was English. It wasn't just a language, it was the bridge between my reality and the future I dreamed of. It was the tool that carried me from a modest home in Brazil to the bright corridors of a hospital in Toronto, where I now wear a white coat and save lives. If you're someone with big dreams, whether you want to be a doctor, an engineer, a pilot, or a global entrepreneur, then you should know this. Mastering English can change everything. It connects you to the world, gives you access to knowledge, people, and opportunities that were once out of reach. Today, over 1.5 billion people speak English, and it's become the language of technology, science, travel, and business. If you don't speak it, you might miss out on life-changing chances, like studying abroad, getting a dream job, or even enjoying books, music, and movies in their original form. I didn't grow up speaking English. In fact, for most of my childhood, I barely knew more than a few simple greetings. But I had something else, a dream so strong that it burned inside me every day. I wanted to become a doctor. I wanted to heal people, to make a difference, to offer hope when it was needed most. That dream seemed impossible at first, but eventually I learned that impossible just means not yet. My name's Sophie. I was born in a small town in Brazil, in a family that wasn't poor but certainly wasn't rich. My father drove a taxi and my mother was a school teacher. We had enough to live, but not enough for luxuries. What we had in abundance, though, was love and the belief that education could transform lives. My parents always told me, if you study hard, you can achieve anything. I believed until I realized that the path to becoming a doctor would require something I didn't have, fluency in English. At the time, it felt like the biggest obstacle in the world. All the medical textbooks were in English, the research, the exams, the university requirements, everything required a command of a language I barely understood. But as you will see, I didn't let that stop me. In fact, learning English became the first real test of whether I was willing to fight for my dream. This is the story of how I went from struggling to read a sentence to confidently writing medical reports and comforting patients. It's a story about fear, failure, resilience, and triumph. And if you're someone who feels stuck, uncertain, or unqualified, I want you to know I was once there too. If I could do it, so can you. Part 2, Childhood and the First Spark of a Dream. I grew up in a quiet, humble neighborhood where everyone knew each other. Our town was small, surrounded by fields and dusty roads, and most families lived modestly. My parents were the kind of people who believed in effort more than luck. They didn't spoil me or my younger brother, but they gave us something much more valuable, a strong foundation built on discipline, love, and hope. My father spent his days driving passengers around in a battered yellow taxi, often working from early morning until nightfall. My mother, with her soft voice and kind smile, taught elementary school children, sometimes even bringing home chalk-stained books to prepare lessons late into the evening. We didn't have much, but we had enough food, enough clothes, and enough support to keep dreaming. Since I was a little girl, my biggest dream, perhaps my only dream, was to become a doctor. It wasn't just a passing thought, it was a deep desire that lived inside me, a sense of calling I couldn't ignore. I was fascinated by everything related to medicine, from the instruments in my mother's first aid kit to the white coats I saw on TV. But it was a personal experience that truly ignited the flame. When I was 10 years old, my younger brother fell seriously ill. He had a dangerously high fever that wouldn't go down, and his small body shook as we rushed him to the local hospital. I remember every detail from that terrifying day. The cold waiting room chairs, the smell of antiseptic, the panic in my mother's eyes. My father's hands trembled as he tried to fill out paperwork. I didn't fully understand what was happening, but I knew one thing. Everyone was scared. Then the doctor walked in. He was calm. His presence felt like a warm blanket in a freezing room. He examined my brother, listened attentively, and spoke gently to my parents. I still remember his exact words. "Don't worry, we're going to take good care of your son." In that moment, something shifted in me. He wasn't just treating my brother, he was restoring peace to our family. A few hours later, my brother's fever broke. He was safe, we were relieved, and I was inspired. From that day forward, I knew with certainty one day I would be the person in that white coat. I wanted to be someone who could step into chaos and bring calm, who could turn tears into smiles. I didn't just want to study medicine, I wanted to live it. But as the years passed and I grew older, I started to realize something frightening. In order to pursue this dream, I would need to master English, and that realization terrified me more than any illness ever could. Part 3. The language barrier, facing the fear of English. By the time I reached my teenage years, my goal of becoming a doctor felt more real than ever, yet also more distant. I had grown more determined, more focused, and I started reading everything I could about biology and the human body. But there was a shadow that followed me wherever I went, the English language. In Brazil, I attended a public school, and like most public schools in my country, English was taught only at a very basic level. We learned how to say hello, how are you, and maybe how to ask for someone's name, but beyond that we were lost. The classes were irregular, the teachers were overwhelmed, and the materials were outdated. English wasn't treated as a priority. It was more like a decoration on the school curriculum. Nice to have, but not necessary. But for me, it was necessary. Deep down, I knew that everything I would one day need to study, from medical books to academic journals, from exams to lectures, would be in English. I started to panic. One memory stands out painfully. I was 15, sitting in English class, when the teacher asked me to read a sentence from our workbook aloud. I looked at the page, and the letters blurred together. The words didn't make sense. They twisted and danced in front of me like a foreign code I was supposed to crack. I tried to open my mouth, but my voice disappeared. Finally, I whispered, "I don't know, miss." The class erupted in laughter. My cheeks burned with embarrassment. I wanted to run out of the room and never return. That night, I sat alone in my bedroom, feeling like a failure. Tears welled up in my eyes as I thought, how can I become a doctor if I can't even read one sentence in English? My dream felt like it was slipping away, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. But life has a strange way of delivering hope when you need it most. One evening, after another long and disappointing day at school, my father came home from work and noticed my silence. He sat next to me and asked gently, "What's wrong, my daughter? You've been sad for days." At first I hesitated. Then I poured my heart out. "Papa," I said, "I want to become a doctor. That's my dream. But my English is terrible. I don't think I can do it." And he was quiet for a long time. Then he said something that changed everything. "If English is standing between you and your dream, then it's time you face it head on. Go where English is spoken, live in it, learn it from life." And I was shocked. "But Papa, we don't have the money for that." He smiled and placed his hand on mine. "We don't have much, but we'll find a way. Your dream is worth the sacrifice." And that was the beginning of a decision that would reshape my future entirely. Part 4, A Family's Sacrifice, The Journey to. After that conversation with my father, something shifted in our home. The idea of studying abroad, something I had never even dared to imagine, suddenly became a real possibility. Over dinner that night, my parents and I sat around our small table and discussed, for the first time, what it would mean for me to leave Brazil. We had no relatives in North America, no safety net, no financial abundance, but what we did have was a shared belief in my dream. My mother, who rarely spoke during such serious talks, looked at me with teary eyes and said, "We have always told you that education is the key. This is the door. We'll help you open it." The first challenge was deciding where to go. The United States and the United Kingdom were popular choices, but the costs were outrageous. Tuition fees alone were more than we could imagine. Then we discovered Canada. It seemed like the perfect balance, a country known for its excellent education system, multicultural society, safety, and, perhaps most importantly, it was more affordable than other English-speaking countries. Still, it wouldn't be easy. My parents didn't have deep savings. Every dollar had a purpose. Groceries, bills, and school supplies for my brother. But slowly they started cutting back on everything they could. My father took on extra driving shifts. My mother stopped buying anything new for herself. I didn't go out with friends or buy snacks after school anymore. Every cent went into what we started calling the Dream Fund. I still remember the day we booked the plane ticket. My father opened his old wallet, pulled out a small wad of bills, and placed it on the kitchen table. "This is all we've saved," he said. "It's not much, but it's enough to get you started." With that money, we paid for my English course in Toronto, my first month's rent in a small shared apartment, and a one-way ticket to Canada. I packed one suitcase. It contained a few changes of clothes, a notebook, a Portuguese-English dictionary, and my dreams. The night before I left, my mother sat beside me on my bed. She held my hand tightly and said, "Sophia, we are giving you everything we have. Please promise me you won't give up." Tears streamed down my face. "I promise, Mama," I whispered. When I landed in Toronto, I was overwhelmed. The cold was the first shock. It was the middle of winter, and the air cut through my jacket like knives. In Brazil, even the coldest days were warm by Canadian standards. I had never seen snow in my life. My fingers went numb within minutes of stepping outside the airport. Then came the language. The airport staff spoke fast, with accents I wasn't used to. A taxi driver approached me and asked, "Do you need a ride?" I froze. I didn't know how to respond. I panicked and simply showed him the address on my phone. That night, as I sat alone in my rented room, barely larger than a closet, I cried for hours. The excitement had faded, replaced by fear, loneliness, and doubt. What am I doing here? I don't understand anyone. How I survive, let alone succeed. But deep inside, I remembered my promise. I remembered my mother's words, and even though everything felt foreign and frightening, I knew I wouldn't give up. Part 5, First Days in Canada, Isolation, Culture Shock, and Determination. Waking up in a strange room in a city where nothing felt familiar was one of the loneliest moments of my life. My new home was a tiny rented space in a basement apartment shared with another international student. It had a small bed, a desk, and barely enough light to read by. There was no one to greet me in the morning, no warm breakfast, no voices I could understand. Outside, the streets of Toronto buzzed with activity. Cars, people, snowplows, and freezing wind that stung my face. The city was alive, but I felt like a ghost, floating through a world where I didn't belong. My first trip to the grocery store was a disaster. I couldn't find the things I needed, and even when I did, I couldn't read the labels properly. When I tried to ask a staff member where the rice was, I stuttered and pointed. He smiled politely, but I felt humiliated. That night, I cooked plain pasta and cried as I ate alone. But I had no time to feel sorry for myself. The very next morning, I had to start English classes. I walked nervously into the language school, a small welcoming building near downtown. The teacher greeted everyone with warmth. "Welcome, everyone. Let's introduce ourselves." When my turn came, I stood up, hands trembling, and said, "My name, Sophia. I'm from Brazil." That was all I could manage before panic shut my brain down. I could feel my face burning. Some students smiled supportively, but others giggled. I sat down quickly and stared at my notebook, ashamed. That night, I lay awake in bed and asked myself, is this really worth it? But then I remembered my mother's voice. I remembered the sacrifices. I remembered the dream. And so I made a decision. I wrote it in bold letters on the first page of my notebook. No matter how hard it gets, I will learn English. I will become a doctor. From that moment forward, I stopped expecting it to be easy. I knew there would be embarrassment. I knew people would correct me. I knew I would make mistakes. But I also knew that every mistake was a lesson. Every awkward conversation was progress. I created a plan. Every day I would practice speaking, even if I had to talk to myself. I would watch English movies without subtitles. I would learn 3 new words and use them in sentences. I would stop being afraid of sounding wrong because the only real mistake would be giving up. Canada still felt cold, both in temperature and in spirit. The culture was different. People kept their distance, spoke quickly, and seemed to always be in a hurry. In Brazil, we hugged, kissed on the cheek, shared food, and talked loudly. In Canada, everyone values personal space and polite small talk. I felt like an outsider. But every morning, I told myself, you came here for a reason. You belong here, not yet in language, but in purpose. Slowly, I began to adapt. I learned to smile and say sorry when someone bumped into me. I discovered how to order coffee at Tim Hortons. I started noticing patterns in speech, catching common phrases and mimicking how people talked. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. That progress, slow and sometimes invisible, became my fuel. I didn't need to speak fluently overnight. I just needed to keep moving forward, one awkward sentence at a time. Part 6, Learning Strategies, How I Learned English in the Real World. The traditional classroom wasn't enough. I quickly realized that attending a few hours of English class per day would never be enough to reach fluency, especially if I wanted to succeed in the highly demanding world of medicine. If I wanted to not just learn English, but live it, I needed to take matters into my own hands. So I built a system, not a perfect one, but a personal one, something that worked for me with the tools I had and the fears I carried. 1. The headphone trick. Talking to myself without shame. One of my biggest problems was speaking. I was terrified of sounding foolish. I didn't want people to laugh at my grammar or accent, but I needed to practice out loud and constantly. So I came up with a clever solution. Every day I would put on a pair of headphones and walk around the city pretending to be on a phone call. In reality, I was talking to myself, describing everything I saw. I am walking to the store. The sky is grey. There is a woman with a yellow umbrella. I'm going to buy some fruit. This simple act helped me in 2 big ways. First, it allowed me to think in English. Second, it reduced my fear of speaking in public. People just assumed I was having a conversation, and I felt protected behind the illusion of a phone call. 2. The 3 new words rule. I made it my mission to learn 3 new words every day. Not 10, not 20, just 3. But I had one rule. I had to use them that same day in a real sentence, either spoken or written. I carried a small notebook with me everywhere. If I heard a word I didn't know on the bus, in class, or in a coffee shop, I would write it down. Then I'd look it up later, memorize it, and practice using it in a full sentence. Over time, this small habit made a huge difference. My vocabulary grew naturally, not from a textbook, but from life itself. 3. Turning off subtitles. Like many learners, I watched English movies and TV shows with subtitles. At first, it felt helpful, but eventually I realized I wasn't listening, I was just reading. So I made a scary decision. I turned off the subtitles. The first few days were rough. I understood almost nothing. I had to replay scenes over and over. But slowly, something magical happened. I began to hear phrases I had studied. I started to understand jokes, tones, and emotional nuance. I didn't just hear words. I heard the meaning. Well, speaking no matter what. One day, I set a goal for myself. I would have a conversation with a native speaker, even if it was just a short one. Even if I messed it up. At a coffee shop, the barista smiled and asked, "What can I get for you today?" My heart pounded. "You can do this," I told myself. "I would like a cappuccino, please," I said slowly but clearly. He responded, "Regular milk or almond?" For a moment I froze, but then I understood her. "Regular, please," I replied. She handed me the coffee and said, "Here you go. Have a great day." I smiled. "You too." It was a tiny conversation, less than 30 seconds, but it made me feel like I had won an Olympic gold medal. That moment showed me something I'll never forget. Fluency isn't about being perfect, it's about being brave. Part 7, surviving as an immigrant student, work, budget, and burnout. Learning English was one battle, but surviving in Canada was a different war entirely. This was the part of my journey no one warned me about. The exhaustion, the anxiety, the constant pressure of making ends meet in a foreign country. Canada was beautiful, yes, but it was also expensive. I soon realized that I couldn't rely on my parents forever. They had already given everything they could, nearly empty their savings just to get me there. Now it was up to me to survive, to work, to keep moving forward without asking for help. I sat down and calculated my monthly expenses. Rent for my tiny room, $800, 0 cents. Groceries, about $250, 0 cents. $120, euro cents. Doggenbull, $50, 0 cent. English classes, $500, 0 cents per month. That was a total of over $1,700, 0 cents every month. And I had it even included small extras like toiletries, books, or the occasional emergency. I needed to find work fast. Luckily, Canada allows international students to work part-time during the school term. After a week of searching, I found a job at a small cafe near my school. The owner was kind, the hours were flexible, and most importantly, it paid enough to help me cover some of my basic expenses. But it wasn't easy. Every weekday looked the same. Wake up at 6 o'clock a.m., go to English classes from 8 o'clock a.m. to 1 o'clock p.m., rush to work, the afternoon shift at the cafe, come home by 8 o'clock p.m., cook a quick dinner, then study until midnight. Sometimes I'd fall asleep with my book still open. There were days I felt like I was being crushed from all sides. My feet hurt from standing for hours. My brain was tired from switching between languages. My heart ached with homesickness. I missed my family, my brother's jokes, and my mother's food. But flights to Brazil were too expensive. Just one ticket cost more than 2 months of rent. And still, I kept going. I reminded myself of why I was there, of what I was fighting for. I replayed my promise to my mother: I will not give up. One day, I opened my banking app and saw that I had only $5 left. That night, I cried harder than I had since I first arrived. I sat on the edge of my bed, looking at that number, $5.00, and asked myself, is this worth it? Am I just chasing an impossible dream? But deep down, I already knew the answer. I'd come too far, I'd struggled too much, I had no intention of giving up. The next morning, I made another decision. I would live as simply as possible, save every cent I could, and invest every spare moment into improving my English and preparing for medical school. I wasn't going to just survive, I was going to build the future I came here for. Part 8, a turning point, thinking in English and real conversations. They say fluency isn't a single moment, it's a collection of tiny wins. But for me, there was one day, one sentence, one response that changed everything. For the first several months, every English interaction felt like mental gymnastics. When someone spoke to me, I had to translate their words into Portuguese in my head, think of an answer in Portuguese, then mentally convert it back into English, all while trying to smile and nod like I understood everything. It was exhausting. By the time I was ready to reply, the conversation had already moved on. But one day, something shifted. I was at the grocery store picking up basic items, bread, eggs, a few apples. As I placed my items on the conveyor belt, the cashier smiled and asked, "Do you need a bag?" And without thinking, without translating, I replied, "No, I have one, thanks." It was so natural, so automatic, that I didn't even realize what I had done until I walked out of the store and froze on the sidewalk. Wait, I didn't translate that, I just answered. I smiled to myself like a crazy person. That moment, it's 5 simple words, was more meaningful to me than any grade I'd ever received. From then on, I paid attention to my inner voice, and gradually it began speaking to me in English. When I was walking down the street, my thoughts would say, "I need to go home soon," instead of "preciso ir para casa." When I was planning what to cook, I thought, maybe I'll make pasta tonight, not talvez. I was starting to think in English, and that, more than anything else, was the turning point. But there was still one fear I hadn't fully faced: real conversations with native speakers. In class, I could talk to other international students. We were all making mistakes, so it felt safe. But speaking to someone born and raised in Canada, that terrified me. I worried they would judge my accent, my grammar, my awkward pauses, so I avoided it. If someone spoke to me, I'd smile, nod, and keep my replies short. Yes, aha, exactly, even when I didn't fully understand what they said. One morning, though, I made a promise to myself: today, I'm going to have a full conversation, no hiding, no fear. I walked into my favorite coffee shop, or the same one where I had once struggled to order a drink. I stood in line repeating possible conversation starters in my head. Then the girl behind me sighed and said, this line is always so long." I took a breath and said, "Yeah, it's really busy this morning." She smiled. "I come here every day and it's always like this." I replied, "Oh, really? I just moved here, so I didn't know." She asked where I was from, and we ended up chatting for almost 5 minutes. I was nervous, yes. I stumbled a few times, but I spoke, and more importantly, I connected. That conversation gave me something I hadn't felt in months: confidence. Confidence made everything easier: listening, speaking, and even thinking. I was no longer trying to pass as someone fluent. I was someone growing in fluency. I had earned that right. Part 9, from fluency to finesse, sounding like a native. Fluency, it was a victory, but I wanted more. Once I had the confidence to hold everyday conversations in English, I realized something. My grammar was improving, my vocabulary was expanding, but I still sounded like someone who was translating from Portuguese in her head. The sentences were correct, but stiff. My intonation was flat. I didn't sound like the people around me. I wanted to not just speak English, I wanted to sound like I belonged in it. So I began my next challenge: finesse. That's when I discovered the shadowing method. It was a technique used by actors, language learners, and public speakers. But the idea was simple: listen to a native speaker say something, then repeat it exactly. Same tone, same rhythm, same emotion, like a shadow. Every evening, I watched English TV shows and paused after each line. If a character said, "Oh my God, that's insane," I'd pause and repeat, "Oh my God, that's insane." Not just the words, the feeling, the speed, the natural rise and fall of their voice. At first I felt ridiculous, alone in my room, talking to my laptop like a parrot. But slowly it worked. My pronunciation improved. My ear became more sensitive to nuance. I started understanding sarcasm, humor, and frustration, not just in words, but in how they were spoken. Next, I created what I called my mistake journal. Every time I made a mistake in English, whether in writing, speaking, or class, I wrote it down. Then I rewrote it with the correction, for example. I agree with you. I agree with you. Each night before bed, I reviewed that journal. I didn't punish myself for my errors. I studied them like clues. Over time, I stopped repeating the same mistakes. My sentences became smoother, more natural, more me. But perhaps the most important step of all was surrounding myself with native speakers. It was hard, emotionally hard, but I knew I had to leave the comfort zone of speaking only with other international students. So I started doing three things. Joining local events. I found community meetups for students, language exchange clubs, and even volunteered at a weekend art fair. At first, I stood silently in the corner, but eventually I started introducing myself. One conversation led to another. Using conversation apps, I downloaded a few apps where Canadians were learning Portuguese. We exchanged languages. I helped them with theirs. They helped me with mine. It was awkward at first, but soon became fun. Connecting with co-workers. At the cafe where I worked, I forced myself to chat with the Canadian staff. I asked about their weekend plans, their favorite food, and their music. These tiny conversations taught me more slang and cultural references than any textbook ever could. Through all of this, I stopped being the girl learning English. I became just a friend, a classmate, a co-worker, someone who could connect through language, not struggle with it. At this point, I wasn't just understanding English. I was living it. I was dreaming in it. I was laughing at it. And though I still had an accent, something I now wore proudly, I knew I had reached the level I once believed was impossible. Part 10, the final test, IELTS and medical school. Even with all the progress I had made, one final hurdle stood between me and my dream of becoming a doctor, the IELTS exam. To apply to medical school in Canada, I needed to prove my English proficiency with a high IELTS score, especially in writing and speaking. It wasn't enough to get by anymore. I needed to perform with precision, clarity, and confidence under pressure, and that terrified me. IELTS wasn't just a language test. It was a test of endurance, nerves, and academic thinking. I had heard horror stories from other students, native speakers who scored poorly, excellent writers who choked during the speaking section, fluent speakers who ran out of time in reading. I didn't want to be one of them. So I treated IELTS like it was the entrance exam to life itself. Every day for months I studied. I bought prep books, watched YouTube tutorials, joined online forums, and practiced past exams. I recorded myself answering sample speaking questions, then played it back to critique my tone, clarity, and grammar. I wrote essay after essay, opinion pieces, formal letters, data analysis reports, and asked my English teacher for feedback on every single one. Reading was my toughest section at first. The passages were long, dense, and full of unfamiliar terms, so I trained my eyes to skim and scan. I practiced identifying keywords, matching information, and managing my time like a clockmaker. But writing, that was my battlefield. I spent hours perfecting sentence structures, learning transition words, and memorizing sample phrases like, on the one hand, / on the other hand. It is widely believed that this leads to the conclusion that I transformed from a learner into a strategist. I wasn't just learning English, I was learning how to play the exam's game. Finally, the day arrived. I walked into the testing center with shaking hands. My stomach felt hollow. As I sat at my desk waiting for the reading section to begin, I whispered to myself, Sophia, you didn't come this far to give up now. You've earned this. You're ready. I took a deep breath and I began. Reading, I paced myself carefully. I marked answers with confidence. Writing, I planned my essay before touching the keyboard. I structured every paragraph with discipline. Listening, I stayed calm even when I missed a word. I didn't panic. speaking. I smiled at the examiner, answered with authenticity, and imagined I was just having a conversation with a friend. When it was over, I stepped outside and let out the biggest breath of my life. I didn't know my score yet, but I knew one thing: I had done my best. A week later, I opened the email that changed everything. Overall band score 8. I cried, I laughed, I held the printed result in my hands like it was a golden ticket. I had passed. Not just the test, but the most difficult chapter of my journey so far. With that score, I applied to several universities. A few months later, I received the letter I had dreamed of since I was 10 years old. Congratulations, Sophia, you've been accepted into the Doctor of Medicine program at the University of Toronto. It wasn't just an acceptance letter, it was a key, a passport to the life I had imagined for so long, and it all started with one sentence I couldn't read back in school. Part 11, becoming a doctor, saving lives and sharing the truth. Getting accepted into medical school felt like standing on top of a mountain, until I realized that the real climb had only just begun. Studying medicine in a second language was the most intellectually demanding thing I had ever done. All the textbooks were in advanced, highly technical English. The professors spoke fast, used medical jargon casually, and expected everyone to keep up without missing a beat. I quickly learned that being accepted didn't mean being ready. It just meant I had to rise to the next level. So I returned to the habits that had saved me before. I recorded lectures and listened to them again at night. I built flashcards with every difficult term. I joined study groups with classmates, even when I was nervous to speak, and forced myself to explain concepts out loud in English. Slowly, the impossible became manageable, and the manageable became routine. After years of grinding through sleepless nights, lab reports, anatomy exams, and clinical rotations, the moment finally arrived: graduation day. I walked across the stage, dressed in my white coat, and received my diploma. Doctor of Medicine, Sophia Williams. My eyes welled with tears. I looked up and whispered, "This is for you, Mum and Dad." I had made it. I'd not only learned English, I'd used it to reach the summit of my lifelong dream. But the journey didn't end with a degree. I started my residency at a major hospital in downtown Toronto. In my first month, I earned more than I ever imagined, over $80,000, 0 cents a year. I looked at my bank account and I remembered the nights I cried with only $5 to my name. Now, I have the privilege of helping others through their hardest days. I held the hands of frightened patients, reassured anxious families, and watched children smile again after treatment. One day, a little girl was rushed into the ER, pale and trembling. Her mother was in tears. I took the girl's hand and said gently, "Don't worry, sweetheart, I'm going to take care of you." The mother looked at me and whispered, "Thank you, doctor." And in that moment, I felt something deeper than success. I felt purpose. But let me tell you something important. None of this happened because I was lucky. I wasn't born rich. I wasn't born fluent. I wasn't born brilliant. What I was determined to do. I refused to accept the version of me that couldn't read a sentence in English. I fought for something better. So now I want to speak directly to you, the person reading this story. Maybe you've been struggling with English for years. Maybe you feel too old, too shy, too far behind. Maybe you've failed before and think that's the end of the road. It's not. Here's what I know to be true. You don't need perfect grammar to begin. You just need courage. You don't need expensive tutors. You need discipline. You don't need someone to save you. You need to save yourself. Because at the end of the day, no one is coming to do it for you. Not your parents, not your teachers, not your friends. Only you can change your life. So don't settle for average. Don't accept being stuck. Learn English like your life depends on it, because in many ways it does. And one day, just like me, you'll look back at this version of yourself, scared, unsure, but still moving forward, and say, "Thank you for not giving up."